Hey everybody. So one of the points that I and many others have brought up since the announcement of the Nintendo Switch 2 is the fact that this feels less like a sequel console and more like the Switch Pro that we had all been waiting on from around 2022-ish. Now, I'll admit that part of the reason I mention it so much is because it triggers so many people when they hear me say it, but that doesn't take away from the fact that I genuinely believe this is more of a pro console rather than a sequel to the following generation. The biggest reason I feel that way about the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2 is because Nintendo feels like they're really holding on to the Nintendo Switch 1 and afraid to let go and move on. Obviously, you have the form factor, the way this thing runs, the menus, the same dark and light theme that we've had for 8 years now, but it's also the fact that there is such an important focus on everything Switch 1 related, including many of the launch titles as well as the titles that are coming out in the first year. So much so that there's a whole category of games known as the Switch 2 edition. And that's not just the games that were initially released on the Nintendo Switch 1 getting a facelift being known as the Switch 2 edition. Those are upcoming games that have not yet come out for the Switch 1 or the Switch 2, and the default of those versions is the Switch 1 version. So for example, Metroid Prime 4 is upcoming, and instead of Nintendo calling the Switch 2 version of Metroid Prime 4 just Metroid Prime 4, they have to call it the Switch 2 edition. Whereas it feels like if the main focus of this new generation was the Switch 2, they would be calling the Switch 1 edition of it Metroid Prime 4 Switch 1 edition. Does that make sense? Like, the default is the Switch 1 version, and the one that gets the little note at the end is the Switch 2 version. Now, obviously, that's just a notation, right? That doesn't mean too much. And part of the reason why they have to focus on having a Switch 2 edition category is because they plan on bringing forward so many Switch 1 games into the Switch 2. Again, a good majority of all first-party titles that have launched with the Switch 2 since it came out, as well as the games that are coming out through the end of the year, are Switch 2 edition games. They're not exclusive Switch 2 party games. And while Nintendo has not announced any more upcoming Switch 2 editions yet, I highly doubt they would only have a handful of games coming out in 2025 with the notation saying Switch 2 edition. So realistically speaking, a lot of the sequels that are coming out for the Switch 2 are just going to be Switch 2 editions of their Switch 1 versions. So for example, we don't know anything about Super Smash Bros. Ultimate yet. And this is not me making a prediction, this is me discussing a hypothetical scenario. We all saw the effort that was put into Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, and we've all thought for a very long time that you probably cannot expand on Super Smash Bros. Ultimate right now. And we've also noticed that Super Smash Bros. Ultimate has yet to get an update patch for the Switch 2. We still haven't gotten an up-resed version, if I'm not mistaken. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. And for me, it feels very likely that Super Smash Bros. Ultimate Switch 2 edition is going to be the main Super Smash Bros. Title on the Nintendo Switch 2. In the same way that Mario Kart 8 Deluxe was the only Mario Kart title that we had through the lifetime of the Nintendo Switch 1. But even without my absurd prediction about Super Smash Bros., Nintendo has really set the tone with the Nintendo Switch 2's life cycle that it's going to be holding on to the Switch 1. It doesn't intend on leaving it behind. Doug Bowser said from the very beginning, if you can't afford the Switch 2, go pick up the Switch 1. And when the tariffs were announced, they decided to up the prices of the Nintendo Switch 1, an 8-year-old console, if I need to remind you, that has never had a price drop. So while they're only projecting 4.5 million sales of the Nintendo Switch 1 for this fiscal year, they don't necessarily need to project that many sales, nor do they need to make that many sales, because enough people have the console in their hand where they can continue to make money off of new Switch 1 games that will also be on the Switch 2. The issue here is that it puts developers in a very tough position. Actually, it doesn't even seem like it's that tough, it seems like a no-brainer. Do they try to go for the more expensive option and make something strictly for the Nintendo Switch 2 in hopes that it takes off and makes millions of sales? Or do they simply play it safe and have a game released for the Nintendo Switch 1, a console that still very much has a very active user base and is actually selling more units by the day? It's effectively a no-brainer. Why would they make a Switch 2 version of these games when they can just make the Switch 1 version, and that way even the Switch 2 users have a game they could buy? But that also makes a cap on the game that's being made, because now you have game that's being made for hardware that was made in what, 2015 and sold in 2017? So games that are being designed for a 10-year-old tablet. And a lot of these games are on the weaker end, but as we've seen with some third parties even for these lighter games, that caps things off at 30 frames per second. And it doesn't get that same luxury of being optimized for the console by the first-party developer because these are third parties. It's not Nintendo making these games. But even when you look at it from the first-party angle, you see a company that doesn't appear to be confident enough in its newest hardware to make that the primary focus. So if I'm a third-party dev, and Nintendo has this new console, and they have a Switch 1 and they have the Switch 2, and I see that this year Nintendo released only 2 or 3 exclusive first-party titles for the Switch 2, but the vast majority of their games are still made with the Switch One as the base. In my mind, I'm like, yo, they don't even have confidence in their new hardware. Why would I take that risk? I'm gonna play it safe and go with the device that has over 150 million units sold. And you might be thinking, well, yeah, they just started their new console. They don't want to give up the library of their previous one. They still have a fandom. They need to support them. But if you consider back in 2017, the only Wii U title that was released was Breath of the Wild, and not including strictly eShop games for both the 3DS or the Nintendo Switch, you had like 9 Nintendo Switch games and 11 3DS games if I'm counting correctly, and that's considering the Switch didn't launch until March. Whereas now with the Nintendo Switch 2, if you remove Welcome Tour and Drag and Drive, because they're not physical releases, not major releases by any means, you have 6 Switch 2 edition games and 4 Switch 2 exclusive games. And mind you, of those 4 exclusive games, we've only gotten Donkey Kong Bonanza and Mario Kart World. We don't have a release date for Kirby Air Riders, and Splatoon Raiders is like a spin-off title at best. And even then, we still don't have a release date for it either. And this is kind of to be expected. Nintendo held on to the Switch 1's life cycle for as long as it could, and it's still trying to hold on to it because they do not want to let go of that success. And while you can argue it would be dumb to let go of that success, it also shows that they're not confident enough in the Switch 2 to completely move on from everything that the Switch 1 had set up. And that's ultimately going to affect how good the Switch 2 games are. Right, like we already know that Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza started out development on the Nintendo Switch 1, so they're a little bit more deficient. But that's to be expected. Breath of the Wild was a Wii U title after all. But with the upcoming Switch 2 edition games that are going to be some of the largest titles released for the Nintendo Switch 2 this year, they're not even trying to hide the fact that these, at their very core, are Switch 1 games. In fact, rather than trying to hide that they're effectively Switch 1 games, they're staring directly into it. They want it to do very well on the Nintendo Switch 1, almost as much as they want it to bring up the sales for the Switch 2. And it's just a very different vibe than when the Switch 1 came out, because when the Switch 1 came out, people were ready to jump in, and Nintendo had to go all in for the Switch 1. Whereas now you got people second guessing if it's even worth it to get a Switch 2 because you can play these games on your original console. Imagine Pokemon Legends ZA being a Switch 2 exclusive title that was actually built from the ground up for the Nintendo Switch 2. That's a system seller on its own. But the problem is a lot of those people that would be like, well, I have to buy the new console so I can play the game, are going to be okay with playing it on the Switch 1. And I know you might argue about the performance of the title affecting it, and so they're going to definitely want to buy a Switch 2 version for it. But need I remind you, this is the same fan base that bought so many different underperforming Pokemon games and loved them on the original Switch. And you might also argue that this is a console that just came out, you're supposed to be giving it time. But what you're forgetting is that they've been running on a single Switch 1 without any kind of alternate model that was more powerful since 2017. They've had time. There is no reason we should be going into the start of the Switch 2 feeling like we're still dragging our feet slowly into the new generation. They didn't come out of the gates with gun blazing. They came out of the gates as if they're being launched in the middle of a pandemic and worried, the same way the PlayStation 5 had come out. And speaking of which, that's the thing that everybody likes to point to. They're like, oh, well, how's this any different than Sony? Well, for starters, Sony's launch titles and the games that were released in the first few years of its life cycle were not still released as full-price titles on the PlayStation 5 and advertised as the main attraction. And second of all, the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 5 both saw fewer games released over the time span that the PS5 wasn't getting any games. So it's not like they were strictly just releasing games for the PS4 and being like, yeah, go play it on the PS5 now. There were fewer games all around. And in addition to that, Sony fans and everybody in the industry has been critical of the PlayStation 5 for not having all of these exclusives on this brand new expensive piece of hardware. Why would you, as a Nintendo fan, a buyer of a Nintendo console, want something that even the competition is upset with? And not only that, so you have the PlayStation 5 and the PlayStation 4, and then you have the Xbox Series X as well as the Xbox Series S. And perhaps more so with Xbox, people were very critical and saying they were worried that the Series S would be bringing down the performance of the games that would be coming out on the Xbox Series X. And they were actually right to be worried. The PS4 Pro, the Xbox Series S, the Xbox One X, or whatever it was called, the Pro version of the Xbox One, a lot of games were designed with those in mind. And you might argue that that potentially brought down the impact of what could have been on the PlayStation 5 or the Xbox Series X. But the jump in power from the PS5 and the Series X to the ones below them takes you from like the strongest thing in the industry to the second strongest thing in the industry. So if there's a game that came out for the PlayStation 5 and I'm stuck playing it on the PlayStation 4 Pro, at least I know I'm getting the second best experience imaginable from a performance perspective. Whereas the Nintendo Switch is so old and so outdated that the drop off from the Switch 2 to the Switch 1 cannot go unnoticed, right? This is what everybody believes. This is what everybody has been talking about. How much better the Switch 2 is than the Switch 1. And how it's only important to compare the Switch 2 to the Switch 1, not to the industry. And with that significant of a gap between the two consoles, it's going to be significantly more in your face when you're playing a game that was designed for the Switch 1. It's noticeable on the games that started development on the Switch 1 like Bonanza and Mario Kart. Imagine for the games that are coming out with dual releases. Many people today like to talk about diminishing returns, right? That's the big argument that a lot of people like to make, that the PS4 Pro is really good because the Switch 2 is as strong as the PS4 Pro. So even if it was as strong as the PS5 or the Xbox Series S even, it's diminishing returns. It doesn't really matter that much. It's a handheld console. So Nintendo fans themselves, you guys are arguing that there are diminishing returns between the PS4 and the PS5, specifically the PS4 Pro and the PS5. But there are absolutely no diminishing returns in the leap from the Switch to the Switch 2. And then it gets even deeper because a lot of the games that were made for the Switch were based off of engines that were made on the Wii U. Many of those titles were ports, many of them were sequels. So you have all of these Switch games that were based off of engines built from the Wii U, brought into the Switch 2 and being considered the newest, highest-end Nintendo titles. And it's all because Nintendo wants to make the same type of money on the previous generation as they did with the Switch when they brought in all of the stuff from the Wii U. They want to have the same type of success in the sales numbers for the software with as little output as they can because they already have these games made and ready to go. And again, this is something that I've said before, but it worked very well for the Nintendo Switch because there were a lot of people that had the Switch that did not have the Wii U. What was it, like 140 million more Switch 1s were sold versus the Wii U? So yeah, Nintendo was like, who cares if I upset the hardcore 10 million people? There are plenty of people to make up those numbers. But now they want to do it again with the Switch 2, and they're going to get away with it during these launch months because you have the enthusiasts coming in. And it's more than that, because they stretched out the life of the Switch 1 for so long, they're able to release something like Breath of the Wild, and then you got these 23 and 24-year-olds that haven't played it since they were in high school. So they're like, oh, hell yeah, I'll buy the Switch 2 edition version and I'll play that instead. And look, I think for now, Mario Party Jamboree has actually set the tone for a lot of the upcoming titles that we're going to see. For a lot of games that were released on the Switch 1, specifically first-party games, and especially the party games themselves, many people enjoyed them, but a lot of people were complaining that some of these games felt a little bit rushed and felt like there were corners that were cut. Think about the release of Mario Strikers, for example. Well, if they were cutting corners while building games from the ground up for the Nintendo Switch 1, this whole Nintendo Switch 2 edition thing allows them to cut significantly more corners and take the laziest of ways out to bring games over to the modern console. You know, in the Switch 1, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe set the bar. This was a Wii U game that just took off and was amazing. Well, what about Mario Tennis Aces Switch 2 edition? Why would they make a new one and put all that time and effort in there where they could just give this one a little bit of a facelift, add a few upgrade packs in there, 20 bucks for some characters and quartz or something, and now you end up just playing the same game over again in the next generation. This is what it feels like the Nintendo Switch 2 is going to be all about. At least that's the tone that's been set so far. And it's been set with the first-party titles as well as the third-party titles if you paid attention during the Partner Direct with how much focus there was on the Switch 1. And I think for anybody that had to make the investment in order to buy a Nintendo Switch 2, if Nintendo doesn't shift gears soon, and I think it's very unlikely that they shift gears that soon, by the time they start getting games that are built from the ground up for the Nintendo Switch 2, the Nintendo Switch 2 is going to feel more outdated than it might already feel to some people. But hey, at that point, you guys can go buy the Switch 2 OLED for $700 so you can enjoy your Wii U games that look better on the third console that they're sitting on. In any case, if Nintendo actually gives people the Direct that's been rumored since June, perhaps they can put to rest the assumptions of people like me about this console before the holiday season. But it is entirely possible that the big title that you guys are excited for during the holiday season is going to be Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. A game that I and anybody else that has a Nintendo Switch 1 will also be able to enjoy. You know, if we were willing to give $1 to Nintendo, which I'm not, so I'd probably have to wait and buy it used the following year. In any case, that's all I got for tonight. By the time some of you are watching this, I might already be working on my next video. Tomorrow is the Indie Showcase, and I'm actually very excited for the Indie Showcase because it's not just like a Nintendo thing, and there are a lot of indie games that pop out that end up becoming staples in my game nights. So I always keep an eye on these things. There's also the Famitsu sales numbers that are coming out tomorrow morning. I do not know how to feel about Famitsu sales anymore because their numbers were way off versus the actual numbers that were reported by Nintendo, so I don't even know if it's worth my time anymore. Just a quick reminder that the Switch 2 is not the fastest selling console in Japan. That was debunked when Nintendo shared their numbers. If I see something absurd that's shown in the numbers, maybe I'll discuss it in a video, or maybe I'll just do a video about the Indie Showcase and also talk about the Famitsu sales a little bit. We'll see. We'll decide this tomorrow. Either way, thank you guys so much for listening, and I will catch you on the next one.